right, howdy. I suggest people do this. It really worked nicely. Test came back clean. I know everyone here likes this kind of things. I want to talk today a little bit about how monitoring can improve the rest of our companies. This talk's a little bit geared to teams that are of some reasonable size, but I think if you have much smaller teams where people wear a lot more hats, then you should still get a lot out of it. That's, Twitter, you won't find too much there. All right, just a very quick little bit about me. I'm at Groupon, and I just I'm obsessed with data, both in its batch analytics and light statistics and real-time forms. And I found my way into this world of data from the batch analytics side, doing building data products at ComScore and at a small startup that ended up being acquired by Groupon, and I've been learning more about real-time analytics within our organization. And if you spend enough time doing any real-time analytics work, you'll find your way into learning about a lot of monitoring practices, since it's a great use of real-time data. So I am not an operator, operations, production monitoring person, but I have found my way into this world and hope that we can improve both monitoring practices and the rest of the company. Cool, so as slightly more illustrative, at Groupon, they give you jackets for when you cross your 1-year mark, and the rest of my team voted that my nickname was Query Tool. The joke wasn't lost on me. We also at Groupon have this metrics couch, which I encourage people to come and learn all about metrics. This has been really helpful. People literally need a place to sit to learn about what they can do with data. And I figured a couch is a nice place to do it, and people put on different color hats depending on what kind of disaster situation they're in. We also have yellow and green hats, and we sit on the couch and work on the problem. And then recently, I just got married, and some silly thing my friends did was write notes on these napkins for the photographer, and many of my friends wrote metrics-related wedding advice. I'm not sure how to interpret it, but so I've been obsessed with data, and it's been rubbing off on other people, and hopefully I'd like to learn more about monitoring, and then we can learn more about what else we can do with monitoring data. So my thinking, having spent the last year and a half learning about monitoring and real-time data, is that monitoring can wildly improve the rest of our companies, and we can do so through sharing the data that flows through our monitoring systems, as well as sharing the techniques that we've been practicing for some people in the room have been practicing for a very long time. So both the data and the techniques, I think, can wildly improve the rest of the company. I want to talk about some concrete ways to get there and some of the problems to address. Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of personas at these companies. You might have some companies that have none of these types of people. You might have companies that are lots of one version of it. And this isn't to say that no person can be in either of these roles. I mean, one person can form all these roles, but they each have their own way of doing things. They each have their own toolkit. They each have their own motives and goals. But I think it's a pretty common line that everybody wants data. Everyone at the company wants to make decisions with data. The more access to data that you have, you feel better about it. If you're looking at data that you believe is true, you feel better about it. All people, most rational people, would like there to be data available, independent of role. They make different decisions with it. They have different goals, but data is key to how they want to perform their business. But in many of our businesses, where the actual data being generated, the activity that is of interest to the business is happening on our machines, right? It's not as much we collect a bunch of information offline and we want to improve our retail sales across the country. The activity of the business is the bits. It's the juice of what's happening is flowing through the systems, which puts the monitoring core people who understand monitoring technologies, understand monitoring data. They're very close to what's actually happening. Whereas the rest of the people, they might be writing the application code that might be generating the data, or business intelligence people might be later after the fact analyzing it to try to make a longer term decision, and like product and executives and data scientists all take offline and some real-time versions of this data, but they're somewhat removed from it. The data that flows through our systems is like as it is birthed, we get it. And so we got first crack at it, and we are very close to it. So we're very aware of what exists in our data within the company, and we're much closer to it than these other groups. But there are some problems. This leads to some set of issues, some of which are reconcilable, some of which aren't because we've done a bad job. They're just some natural issues that have seemed to come up that I've noticed. So one is that we've created these divergent data processing paths of the same data. So, data is being generated by apps or systems like machine metrics, third-party information that's coming in. However data is being born, whatever form it's being created in, whether it be log files or structured events or metrics themselves being generated. And then they frequently go through one or neither or both of these paths, which is, there's a monitoring version, which is you have streaming analysis or very, very quick batch analysis if you're not doing event streaming, that where you want to get these things into metrics, you want to do graphs and alerts for monitoring, and then you might want applications that use the real-time streaming data to feed back into your app or do something else with it. And then the same data takes a slower path through ETL systems where it's being manipulated and transformed in some way with a bunch of business rules, and it's being loaded into analytic systems maybe it's being dumped into Hadoop for later processing, or a big Teradata or Netezza or whatever kind of large-scale relational database system you have, and then people query against it in a BI kind of batch way. They ask questions against it, pre-canned reports. So it's the same data, and it's going down two different processing paths, and they each have their own sets of rules. You might have a rule that says that a page view in the monitoring system is or isn't with bot traffic, and then the ETL guys have to say, hey, what's that bot traffic filter you've been using? We got our own, and we got to compare numbers because nothing matches. The data comes out different, it starts the same. Also, these systems, and I'll slow myself down and not talk about this too much more, but I find this part very interesting. It's they have different goals. It's for streaming, you'd rather be real time, as close to real time as possible, but if you burp and you miss a few minutes, it's no big deal. We're not going to stop the presses, reprocess data, and then try to catch up. We just say, hey, let's try to have fewer hiccups, and let's get back to the real-time processing. Meanwhile, ETL systems, that's completely unacceptable, right? That's data of truth. People are paid or not paid or release numbers to Wall Street. On the second path, you hold the horses and you get the data correct, and then you continue, or you reprocess later. So they have different goals. I'm not saying they should be the same thing, but it's worth considering that they are different and they start the same. And then, I mean this to be a confusing chart. All these different kinds of, when you have these different types of questions from these types of personas within your company, and the data is the same, and they each ask different pieces of it, different kinds of questions in two totally different systems, which means you can ask the same question and get 4 different answers. Right? How many page views happened 1 week ago for this hour period of time? I think we can, you could see how one system might have gotten this right or wrong because they have different goals and different filters or different business intelligence kinds of rules on top of these things might produce different results, which means that the teams have a harder time communicating because we have different sets of numbers, and that's one of the ways we communicate. And we can walk through all the different relationships, but suffice it to say, we all want access to the data. We want it in the way that we want it, and we want it all to be as true as possible. And that's created too many huge branching, a tiny list of the available things, list of the tools in each of these stacks. And for monitoring, everyone in the room knows this stuff better than I would, but there's a huge list of stacks for ad hoc, for storage, for visualization reporting, for alerting escalation. And there's a matching and also insane branching tree of open source and paid products in the ad hoc side, you'll notice that Excel is in every category, right? Like people use Excel for every possible thing except for the last one. In fact, this last one for alerting and escalation, like there is no, I know of no real thing. Like maybe someone's hacked together something. And so we're all asking questions against the same data. We're using vastly different tools. Some of these require you to be a super nerd. Some of these require you to be a person who would choose to never be a nerd. Some of these things, take like, some of these you can only access through command line. Some people will just run away from command line instinctually, right? We have all types of people within these companies. Again, we all want to access the same data. We're doing it in a gazillion different ways. And this isn't to say that the reason why these individual systems exist isn't good, right? They solve a great problem and they do it in a way that's focused, but we should recognize that they exist and see if we can patch it in a way that we can communicate better. Of course, we have this monitoring focus on metrics, and it's great for us. But some people just look at this and say, listen, this is not for me. This is not the data that I need, even though that the data is in the machines that generate this as well. They just say, hey, monitoring data is not for me because I don't recognize these things to be relevant to me. Same with some of the views. We understand that some of our views can only make sense in certain ways, and if I want minute data and I roll back for 180 days, it looks crazy, or I have some wildcard thing that generates new lines, and so occasionally views look like this, or there's some anomaly and the graph doesn't know to do or don't do, you show something. And this is all fine for us. We're used to, it's not fine, but it's currently okay enough that we can get by. But some people just see something like this and say, listen, it's just not for me. I expect it to look cleaner and smoother and be bar charts and whatever it is. Same data, different representation, and some people just, this doesn't support their need. They don't need minute data. They want other types of roll-ups. There's also different incentives of teams. For monitoring, what team is it even in? And it doesn't play, sometimes operations teams will have struggles inherently because if nothing changes, it's easier to keep up, right? But there's a balance between reliability and change. How involved should monitoring be in planning ahead of time? Could we just assume that the rest of our developers are going to properly measure and log and give us heads up before things get into the world of production? Do we hamstring ourselves by being that far upstream? It's hard to get as much budget as probably is warranted because the people who control the budgets don't understand don't fully understand what's happening under the hood. I mean, it's sort of if there are no fires, the fire department didn't do anything. If there are lots of fires and they did a really good job, then it's also less noticeable. And so occasionally, they have to rescue a cat out of the tree to just show that we're awesome. And then people say, oh yeah, we got to fund this thing. And it's not a completely apt analogy, but the better operations is at noticing these problems. It's actually works sort of against the budget, and then obviously it can be a lot of churn because it's a tough job, and you have on-call escalation, the whole thing. So then it's worth taking a second and being is this good or bad? Is this just fine or not? And I think it's good in some ways because it's created this whole stack of independent components that are good at its individual pieces, which is great. And there's focus, there's ownership, there's specific tools for specific roles. That all sounds good to me. But there's some real bad stuff in here. There's no context between these systems, and when people try to communicate with data, they don't have the same access to the versions of the data that other people do, and it's siloed work. If we improve our graphing tools, doesn't help the CEO look at what's happening quarter over quarter, and people are in this data dark, some stupid term I yell at people about. Basically, someone will say, you go to someone and be oh, did you make that? How'd you make the decision? Did you use any data? And they'd be well, I just don't have access to any. Be well, I have access to all of it, so couldn't I have helped you? And you can't. That's not a scalable thing to just be responsible for having individually provisioning or getting people the data they want, or even building the tools to do so. And so that leads to a lot of misunderstanding. All right, so I have some fixes. They're high level. Some of which are things that you can buy, build, implement, open source stuff, non-open source stuff. And you'll see how they apply to you if they don't apply to you. But these have been somewhat successful in alleviating some of the problems. Okay, so these have to do with end-to-end data pipeline. So it should be, I think a great world would be where you can pipe data one time. You've heard this many times today, so I won't repeat the pieces that you've already heard ad nauseum. You want to be able to pipe data into one kind of flow, and then have that flow be available at the right timing with the right views to the right people, like in the life cycle of the data. So the first way to get started on this is structured logs. I think this has been very well articulated many times here, where you have a payload of the event, and you're not a priori saying what you find to be true or not true, or what you expect to happen, or what you want to increment. Simply log what happened. Like, log the events that happened, do it in a structured way, and that'll let the pipeline have access to a lot more information. And once you choose to do that, you can do an optional config for each of these event types, right? You could say, hey, like this web event or this iPhone event or whatever is happening, I can choose to say, that this particular key really means this, and it's of a latency, and I'm going to actually have one more slide here to talk more about the config, but you can give more metadata about your events up front, which will help the rest of the pipeline. Measure once, you've heard this a few times today too, it's like, just measure the thing that happened, and then let other processes that do alerting or evaluation or summing or smoothing or graphing, whatever it is, read from that store. Just measure one time, and that's it. So automatic metrics, like if you see data that's coming in that is of latency type, because you put it into a little config, then you can automatically generate medians and 95th percentiles, all the stuff you'd expect. You don't have to put the burden onto yourself or another person or team to, okay, say, oh, this number is actually latency, and it should be milliseconds, or whatever it is, and then update the graphs. Like, if you tag the pieces of your events as the type they are, then the pipeline can understand what it is and then make correct views for you. This one is pretty optional, but like, we like to build an API on top of the data that's flowing through, so that our graphing systems and other types of analytics tools that help us do like real-time pricing and a bunch of other things, they read from an API that's on top of the log stream that, so in theory, anyone could be a first-class citizen on top of monitoring data, including us. Graph tools, either build them or buy them. Not much to say here other than you need to make them pretty good for the world. You've heard it a bunch today, but it's a worthwhile investment. This one it's been really helpful to think about. It's like, if you're logging and you have these events, you should be able to go to some URL and see, like, here is the glossary. It's like a dictionary of all the events that have been logged recently or of all time, and here's a summary of their keys and who did them and what machines they're coming from. It gives you a place to go and see the full set of what's available, like the metadata of all the data that you have in one place. Like, it's a light thing to do, but having it searchable and browsable by anyone makes it feel like anyone has access to all of it, which I think is good, obviously permissioning aside. I'll just skip over those pieces. And then being in control of the whole pipeline, which I'll talk about in a second. So for structured events, this is like the kind of thing I'm talking about, like JSON or whatever. You want to have like some optional config, and our config is like very light and can change over time. It's like, hey, it's the name of the column, it's like the name of the key, here's like the column I do or don't want it to be in some relational store later, it's of type this. It's completely optional because we don't want to put any barrier to new logging. We want people to just log like however they want expressively, quickly. But if you choose to put this into a little bit more of a structured event, then you can create this, you could check in some YAML file that has this information, and then the pipeline is now aware of the information that's flowing in each event. And we want to tag things like, this is of latency, so all the graphs that have this data in it know it to be latency, or this is a funnel step, and like you can like label the funnel step, what number it is, or this is like the prose text description of what it is. It's the hover button on on the whatever thing, like written out by the person who logged it, because then later the system can be like, oh, you're looking at this line, like it is this thing because it knows where to read it from. And then we like allow people to signify like what kind of storage they want. Like, hey, I only need this data around for a day or a month, or it should be rolled up in certain. You can chuck the raw data after rollups, or I need this forever. It's got to hit some long-term store. And then we have like the automatic stuff that you can build now. Like you can automatically build these graphs and dashboards because you know who logged something, you know what the events are, you know what the descriptions of them, and just like you can just have a dashboard that's those things by the views that they should be based on what's in the config, and you know the person who logged it, so you can just send him or her an email being like, your dashboard's ready, like 8 seconds after they logged for the first time. That's better than self-service. It's like to the face, like self-service. We do some like, I mean, it's kind of hacky, but once somebody comes up with like a nice looking view, and we have a lot of engineers, so we have a lot of people like hacking around on this stuff, but it doesn't apply to all use cases. Like doing wildcard templating, where just like, hey, anything that we're always going to track certain metrics by browser type, and many people would be interested in a very good looking browser type thing where the colors like match the colors of the browser, and someone just spent an extra hour or 10 minutes, whatever it was, on a hack day or during work or whatever, and made this graph. A graph template, like here, we've wildcarded it. You can use it sort of like a gallery for graphs internally in a hacky kind of way. You can automatically make these views and statistics, like if something is latency, you care about like all its different percentile times, and so you can generate statistics in whatever processing system that you're using that says, okay, if this thing is of latency type, like automatically pre-calculate its median, 95th, 99th, whatever you're doing. The glossary we mentioned. And then for both batch analytics and long-term storage, it's just like being in control of the pipeline and automatically push these things into their long-term storage place. And then again, if there is config, then you can apply the rules that they've set. Okay, so that's like the build stuff part. And I also want to talk about how we can all work together with each of these types of disciplines to like build stuff for them, like learn from them, how to communicate well, and then like what we can do to inspire them to be awesome, basically. So. Like if you're working, if you have a large-scale like application development team, one thing to build is this like sort of logging toolkit and the data pipeline. Like, hey, like here's a quick way of how you log. Like it's got to be, if you're doing it in this format, you're going to get all this awesome stuff for free. Or here's some like library bindings that like will restrict you to that structured event if you want. And then if you do so, you're going to get this whole awesome data pipeline which does all these great things for you. And that's a really helpful thing to build. And then to learn is like as early as possible, figuring out like what the pain points are in using the pipeline system, as well as like what are causes of outages and performance issues, so that you can you can help be aware of them ahead of time, and also create views that might be helpful before there are problems. Kind of an obvious point, but something I think we should, when you write it down, then take it more seriously. Communicating like what are clear deployment practices as organizations grow, and if they might have different types of teams, they might have different types of deployment practices. So it's important to communicate those clearly. Escalation playbook, when there are alarms and alerts go out. We've also heard that a lot the last 2 days. And then what can we do to inspire? I think one is this measurement as test-driven development has been talked about a bit too, and I think that's a really thoughtful thing to do, and I think something holding it back is just that it's too hard for developers ahead of when a thing is getting either traffic or manufactured traffic to use measurement as a way of driving the design. So if we make that a lot easier to do, which I thought Mark's presentation yesterday was spot on about, then measurement as test-driven design I think becomes a real reality. And also to Mark, I thought Mark's talk yesterday was just fabulous, but the monitoring your staging environment the same way gives you the communicates to the entire company that we're like taking measurement and monitoring really seriously. It's just like a core practice. It's not on one hand or the other. It's not some special thing. It just simply is. And if you want to be great at it, you'll probably start developing against it because it just is. Okay, so for like business analysts, one thing that what we've built is going to really help them with is like structured logs, right? Like if you have unstructured logs and you're going to try and get into some relational database system, you've basically just like thrown the hard work over the wall to some regex monster, and like that ends up not being any fun for anybody. And so if you have these structured logs and you have the config saying like this column is important and it's named this thing and it's of this type, then like that gives you the chance to do automated ETL in a like very straightforward way. You just read from the events that are coming in, you look up its config, and you can choose to load it or not. Okay, so one thing to learn is that we should be learning from that is that I found that the business analysts, having been one in a prior life, are much closer to the like day-to-day definitions of what is important in terms of the behavioral or business metrics. And if we can learn those definitions, then we can build those into our real-time systems, and then we're closer to being able to communicate one-to-one because we'll have the data so it's the same data, but it'll be flowing through the same filters, and so it will hopefully come out a bit cleaner, and it will be easier to communicate and make decisions together. And also, there are just certain slices and visualizations, and hey, this country's data should be wrapped up in some like, APAC group or whatever it is. If we get these slices and the visualizations of those things closer to what the business analysts do, then you can also communicate more easily and maybe recognize problems that they're going to take days or weeks or months to notice. But if you have the same slices and views in your real-time systems, you might be able to create an alert that could notice a problem much sooner. Another thing that we should be communicating is like, we have a very early look at data size changes and cardinality, like the number of unique keys or whatever per stream. And like both serious changes in data size and cardinality outside of historical norms are like major issues across everything, but especially a problem when you're trying to load these things into some relational system or run an algorithm against it that expects the distribution of the hash key to be more normalized than it ends up being for this particular hour. But if we can test and sample and like communicate further downstream, like, hey, this stream has this major change, then it'll clue these people in earlier rather than like something blows up our system or doesn't, and then it does or doesn't blow up the next system as just like a bowling ball like rolling down the hall. And also communicating like outages and delays, like if people are expecting there to be X number of million events per day and they run some query that they expect to be right and turns out the data is not loaded correctly or is wrong, then things are off and they're unaware. And then we should be able to, I feel like the monitoring practice is so flexible. Like, let's get in there, let's change it, let's make it, if it doesn't exist yet, let's like hack it up. And I don't see that flexibility, both in visualization toolkits and just general ethos in this community quite as much. So I think we should try to inspire that. I'm gonna have to hurry just a little bit. For data scientists, like they don't even know what data exists. Like if you have, this is for large scale companies, but if you have like a big data science team or even one data scientist or someone who's just a statistics nerd and wants to do stuff with your data, like if they don't know where the data is or what the metadata is about it, then they're gonna just like be scratching their head. Like they have all this talent, they have all this energy, but they don't even know where to get access to the data. Also, these people like write some query, and then it blows up some resource, and they don't know why. But monitoring has these awesome tools for resource management. Like we should do monitoring on our analytics queries and help the data scientists, better tune their code based on monitoring data. We should learn statistics and models. We've heard that several times. I mean, we're seriously in the dark on that one. And most of the things that we need are pretty rudimentary for what these people think about. And they might need new data streams, so we can learn it from them. Communicate what the context, what's in the logs, that's back to the glossary, so they can just see what events are available and what they mean. And we should inspire that they should use monitoring data to validate their logs. Like someone wants to do some A/B test, and they have some metric that they say, okay, we want revenue to go up, and it's got to be statistically significant. Fine, but that's just like one metric. Like they could do something that's screwing up all of our machines or taking a lot more CPU or whatever it ends up being. They should use all of our metrics to test their algorithms, not just like pick one a priori and say, hey, I want this to go up. If it goes up, then the test is good. And just like come downstairs and teach us some stuff would be great. Okay, and then lastly, this group, it's like for people who want just quick views, if you make them just like one good, clean, curated dashboard that everyone turns to and it's called something great and everyone knows to point to it in times of emergency or success, that's just a huge win. I think it'd be interesting for like graphing and learning tools that allow for like client-side stuff. So someone says like, hey, I want to hit my Q3 goal of this thing. It's on a graph. I'll make my own personal alarm that I can do by just clicking, and it will use the same monitoring software. Learn the business, prioritize alerts by dollar. Like if you get a 10,000 Nagios alerts or whatever people are complaining about, totally reasonable. Like, can we put $1 per minute or like impact per minute, impact per event, whatever it is, metrics, and just sort them? That would go a long way. And we can learn that by talking to these people more. Incident postmortems that use data, great. Teaching metrics granularity, like a 1-minute sessionized checkout flow, like might not make sense. And then inspiring more data decisions, recognizing and celebrating DevOps monitoring wins together, and they'll have a lot more things to look at. So I think monitoring can become this like data platform and improve all the teams with its techniques. It's the closest to the data, it has access to it, it has all these great techniques, let's share it with the rest of the organization. And the Groupon cat, hiring the whole thing. I appreciate your time.